At 78, all I wanted was peace at my family's dinner table. But when my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and called me a freeloader, I said nothing. What she didn't know was that my silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of a lesson she'd never forget. My name is Walter Harris. I'm 78 years old, a widower, and a retired factory supervisor. I've lived a quiet life since my wife, Mary, passed 7 years ago. My days are simple: tending my garden, reading the paper, and taking long walks down our small-town streets. My health isn't perfect, but I manage. What I've always wanted is dignity in these final chapters of my life. But dignity, I've learned, isn't always given freely, especially by family. Every Sunday, I join my son, David, his wife, Melissa, and their children for dinner. It started after Mary passed, when David worried I'd grow too lonely. For a while, it was a comfort, watching the kids chatter about school, smelling the roast chicken in the oven, hearing the clatter of dishes. It reminded me that family was still worth something. But as time passed, I noticed a change. Melissa's smiles grew thinner, her voice sharper. She fussed if I sat in her chair, sighed loudly if I reached for seconds, and sometimes whispered to David when she thought I couldn't hear. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress or weariness. I didn't want to believe she truly resented me. But then came that Sunday. The table was full: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and biscuits, just the way Mary used to make. I sat quietly at the far end, listening to the kids chatter about their video games while David told a story from work. Melissa, though, sat stiffly beside him, her jaw tight. At one point, she glanced at the biscuits and muttered, "I suppose I'll have to make another batch." Some people can't stop helping themselves. I froze, biscuit halfway in my plate. My eyes flicked up. She was staring at me. The table went quiet for a moment, the children's laughter dying in their throats. David cleared his throat, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Melissa wasn't finished. "You know," she said, her voice louder now, "some of us work hard to put food on this table, and some of us—" She paused, her eyes locking on mine. "Well, some of us just freeload." The word hung in the air like smoke. Freeloader. I felt it land on me, heavy and sharp. My hand trembled slightly as I set the biscuit back down. No one spoke. David's face flushed red. The children shifted uncomfortably, and Melissa leaned back in her chair, satisfied with her strike. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts rushed through me. I thought of the 35 years I'd worked at the factory, often double shifts, so David could have college tuition. I thought of the mortgage Mary and I had paid off on the very house they now lived in. I thought of the savings I had quietly funneled to them when David lost his job years ago, savings I never asked to be repaid. And yet, here I was at 78, being called a freeloader at my own son's table. The urge to speak, to shout, boiled in my chest. But instead, I took a slow sip of water, forcing calm into my veins. I said nothing, because silence, I knew, could be louder than words. Melissa smirked, convinced she'd won. David avoided my eyes, ashamed. The children looked between us, confused and uneasy. And me? I sat back in my chair, my heart burning, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. She thought my silence meant defeat. But in truth, it was the first step of a plan forming quietly in my mind, one that would remind Melissa exactly who she was calling a freeloader. The word freeloader stayed with me long after that Sunday dinner ended. I replayed it over and over in my mind as I sat alone in my modest living room that night. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, but inside me, time felt like it had frozen. Freeloader. The insult gnawed at me because I knew how far it was from the truth. I'd given everything for this family. 35 years in the factory, hands cracked and scarred, lungs filled with the dust of machines that never rested. I'd worked double shifts to pay for David's education. When Melissa and David wanted to buy their home, I gave them a down payment from the savings Mary and I had scraped together. When David was laid off years ago, it was my pension and savings that carried them through. And now Melissa had the audacity to look me in the eye and call me a freeloader. The next Sunday, I arrived at their house as usual. I debated not going at all, But I refused to let her push me out. If I stopped coming, she'd think she'd won. Melissa greeted me at the door with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Walter, you're here. I wasn't sure if you'd make it this week." Her tone dripped with false sweetness, and I caught the flicker of satisfaction in her gaze, as if she expected me to have stayed away after her last remark. I simply nodded. Of course I made it. It's Sunday dinner. Family comes first. David appeared behind her, his face weary. He gave me a small nod of acknowledgement, but didn't say much. I knew he'd heard her words last week, and the shame of it weighed on him. But David had always avoided conflict, a trait that left me wondering if Melissa had learned to take advantage of his silence. At the table, things played out much the same. The children talked. David tried to steer the conversation to safe ground, and Melissa tossed her barbed comments like darts aimed squarely at me. When I reached for a second helping of potatoes, she said, "Careful, Walter. Leave some for the rest of us. You wouldn't want to overstay your welcome again." Her meaning was clear. She wasn't talking about food. She was talking about me being there at all. I put my fork down quietly, my appetite gone, though I forced myself to stay seated. Later, as the meal wrapped up, Melissa clattered dishes loudly into the sink and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "I don't know how long we can keep doing this. It's draining, you know? Always having someone else to take care of." My jaw tightened, but again I said nothing. When I left that evening, David walked me out to my car. His face was pale, his words hesitant. "Dad, I'm sorry about Melissa. She's stressed. You know how she gets." I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "David, stress doesn't excuse disrespect. Not to me. Not after everything I've done for this family." He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I know. I'll talk to her." But he didn't sound convinced. And I knew Melissa well enough to know she wasn't about to change because of a gentle word. Driving home, I felt the ache in my bones, but more than that, I felt a fire building inside me. I had held my tongue, let her sharpen her claws, but each word she threw only fueled something deeper. Melissa thought she was wearing me down. She thought each insult chipped away at me, making me weaker. But she didn't realize she was doing the opposite. With every slight, every sneer, every whispered jab, she wasn't breaking me. She was forging my resolve. And one day soon, I would show her that Walter Harris was no freeloader. By the third Sunday after that first insult, I knew Melissa wasn't just being sharp-tongued. There was something more deliberate behind her words. Each week, the barbs grew bolder, less disguised. That evening, I arrived at their home with a pie I'd baked, a recipe Mary had loved, apple with a crumb topping. I thought maybe, just maybe, bringing a piece of her memory to the table might soften the edges. Melissa opened the door, took the pie, and forced a smile. How sweet. More sugar. Just what we need. She set it aside without another word, not even place it on the table. Inside, the kids greeted me warmly, their small arms wrapping around my waist. At least there, I still felt wanted. But when we sat down for dinner, Melissa's tone was sharper than ever. David carved the roast while Melissa leaned back in her chair, her wine glass in hand. "You know," she began, her eyes flicking toward me, "it's not really normal for parents to be at their children's table every single week. Most people your age, they move into places where they can get the help they need." The words were casual, but the intent was clear. My fork froze halfway in my mouth. "Places?" I asked quietly. She gave me a bright, fake smile. "Retirement communities, Dad. Assisted living. You'd probably be happier around people your own age. Less stress on everyone." The room went cold. The children stopped whispering. David shifted uncomfortably, staring down at his plate. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Melissa, are you suggesting I don't belong here?" She shrugged. "I'm just saying you deserve comfort, and we deserve space. It's hard balancing everything. Groceries, bills, making sure everyone's fed. You wouldn't understand. You just sit and eat." The knife slipped clean between the ribs. Freeloader. Burden. Unwanted. I looked around the table. David avoided my eyes. The kids looked confused. And Melissa smiled, satisfied with her performance. Inside, something in me shifted. The ache of betrayal hardened into something sharper. I thought of the years Mary and I had spent building this family, the sacrifices we had made. I thought of every loan forgiven, every bill I quietly covered, every sleepless night I'd worked so David could have a better life. And now, I was being written off like an old coat, pushed toward a community, so Melissa could live freely in a home partly built with my money. I didn't argue with her. Not yet. Instead, I finished my meal in silence, though the roast tasted like ashes in my mouth. When I returned home that night, I didn't collapse into my chair in defeat. No, I sat at my desk, pulled out an old ledger, and began flipping through notes I hadn't looked at in years. Papers, receipts, deeds, records of every contribution I had made to David and Melissa's life. Because while Melissa thought of me as some powerless old man, I knew something she didn't. The house they lived in, the one she ruled like a queen, had been purchased with my money. My name was still on certain papers. Quietly, carefully, I had never let go of control completely. I ran my hand over Mary's picture on the desk. She thinks she can erase me, love. But she doesn't realize I'm still holding the pen. For the first time in weeks, I smiled, not out of joy, but out of resolve. Melissa thought her whispers and smirks were pushing me out, but all she was doing was pushing me closer to a plan, one that would remind her this freeloader still had power she couldn't imagine. That night, after Melissa's thinly veiled suggestion that I move into a place with people my age, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My heart thudded in my chest, not from weakness, but from resolve. Melissa thought she was clever, dropping hints and barbs, testing to see how much I would take before I broke. But what she didn't know was that I had spent a lifetime keeping records, ledgers, receipts, deeds. Numbers and paper had built my world, and they were still my greatest allies. The next morning, I unlocked the old cabinet in my study. Inside were folders neatly labeled, stretching back decades. Mortgage payments, loan transfers, a record of $40,000 I had quietly gifted David when he and Melissa bought their home. And most important of all, the copy of the deed showing my name still attached as partial owner. Melissa thought this was her castle, her domain, but legally, I still had a foothold. She couldn't shove me out, not without dealing with me first. I ran my hand over the papers, my lips pressed into a thin smile. You forgot, Melissa. I muttered. You might run the table, but I still own the legs it sits on. Later that day, I picked up the phone and called an old friend, Richard Cole, a retired attorney who still kept his license active for special cases, as he called them. We had played chess together at the library for years, and I knew he was as sharp as ever. Walter, he said warmly when he recognized my voice. It's been a while. What brings you to me? Richard, I said slowly, I think my daughter-in-law is planning to push me out of my family. I need to know exactly what rights I still have, and I need to be ready. There was a pause on the line. Then Richard's tone shifted, firm and professional. Bring me everything you've got, deeds, receipts, any agreements. We'll look at it together. If Melissa thinks she can bully you, she's in for a surprise. The following morning, I drove into town with a folder under my arm. Richard's office smelled of dust and old wood, much like the man himself, solid, reliable. He spread the documents across his desk, adjusting his glasses. Walter, he said after a while, tapping the deed. This is gold. Your name is still here. Legally, they can't sell, refinance, or do anything major with this house without your consent. And if she's trying to force you into a home against your will, forget it. She has no authority. None. Relief washed over me. But Richard wasn't finished. If you want, we can go further. We can make it crystal clear that you have rights here, not just in the house, but in how you're treated. We could set up protections, even a trust, if you want to make sure Melissa never gets her hands on things when you're gone. I nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. Do it. I want her to know she can't erase me. Not now, not later. When I left his office, the folder was thicker, filled with new papers, new protections. My steps felt lighter than they had in years. That Sunday, when I sat down at the dinner table, Melissa gave me her usual tight smile. "Oh, Walter, you made it again," she said, her voice dripping with false cheer. I simply smiled back, my hand resting on the folder tucked safely in my bag. She thought I was the freeloader, the burden, the old man hanging on by a thread. But what she didn't know was that I'd already secured my ground. Her game was nearly up, and soon it would be my turn to deal the cards. That week, I carried myself differently, not loud or boastful, quietly, calmly, with the steady patience of a man holding aces while the others around him thought he had folded. Melissa, of course, didn't notice. She grew bolder, thinking her jabs were pushing me closer to surrender. At Sunday dinner, she poured the wine and sighed dramatically. "David, you know how much the utilities have gone up? It's like we're paying for 3 households instead of 1. Her eyes flicked toward me, quick as a knife. David cleared his throat. "Melissa," he warned softly. She waved him off. "I'm just saying, times are tough. Maybe it's time to rethink certain arrangements." I smiled politely, slicing my roast beef with deliberate calm. "That's true. Times are tough, which is why it's good the house is secure. Paid off in full years ago. No mortgage hanging over your heads." David nodded, relief flickering in his eyes, but Melissa stiffened. I could see the confusion there. She hated when I reminded her that her so-called kingdom wasn't entirely her doing. I didn't push further that evening. I didn't need to. I had learned long ago that sometimes silence plants seeds deeper than words. A few days later, she called me out of the blue. Her tone was sugar-coated but brittle. "Walter, have you ever thought about selling this house? Downsizing? It's too much space for just us. If we sold, we could move closer to the city. Better schools for the kids. More opportunities for David's career." Her phrasing, "we could sell," didn't go unnoticed. I let out a thoughtful hum. "Well, Melissa, selling would be tricky, I'd have to agree. My name is still on the deed." There was a pause, a sharp inhale, then a forced laugh. "Oh, Dad, I don't think you're remembering correctly. The house is ours now." I leaned back in my chair, smiling to myself. "Check the papers. Melissa, you might find your memory isn't as sharp as you think." Her voice faltered. I'll talk to David." And just like that, the call ended. For the first time, I felt the ground shifting beneath her. That night, I polished the papers Richard had drawn up, ensuring they were clear and airtight. A trust document protecting the house. Provisions that locked Melissa out of ever selling it without my say. Even instructions for what would happen when I was gone. David and the kids would be safe. Melissa would have no claim. I tucked the folder back into the cabinet, my chest lighter than it had been in months. The following Sunday, dinner was tense. Melissa's smile was thin, her hands fidgety as she set plates on the table. David looked tired, like he'd spent the week caught between a storm and a wall. Halfway through the meal, Melissa finally snapped. "Walter, this derangement can't go on forever. You sitting here every week, eating food you don't pay for, living in a house that isn't really yours. It's not fair." The children went silent. David dropped his fork. I set down my knife carefully and looked her straight in the eye. "Not mine, you say? That's interesting. Because my name is still on the deed, which means this house is every bit as much mine as yours." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, clearly unprepared. I smiled faintly. "I haven't said anything all this time, because I didn't want to embarrass you. But if you insist on calling me a freeloader, perhaps next week I should bring the papers and show the children exactly who paid for the roof over their heads." David's had snapped up, his eyes wide. Melissa flushed crimson, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever. She thought I was powerless. But little by little, she was learning the truth. I wasn't the one trapped. She was. The tension from that Sunday dinner hung heavy all week. I could feel it in the way David avoided calling, in the silence from Melissa's end. I knew she was stewing, trying to find a way to claw back control. But she didn't know the control had already slipped through her fingers. The next Sunday, I arrived right on time, folder in hand. Melissa opened the door with her practiced smile, but the stiffness in her jaw betrayed her. "Walter," she said, her voice clipped, "you didn't have to come this week. We've been busy." I stepped inside anyway, brushing past her. Nonsense. I wouldn't miss family dinner. David was at the table, the kids setting out silverware. He glanced at the folder under my arm, but said nothing. Dinner began awkwardly. Melissa barely spoke, her fork clinking against her plate with sharp, deliberate jabs. Finally, halfway through the meal, she set it down and folded her arms. "Walter," she said loudly, her eyes locking on me, "we need to settle this once and for all. You've been throwing around claims about this house, confusing David and upsetting the children. It's time to stop pretending. This isn't your home. It's ours." David shifted uncomfortably. "Melissa," but she held up a hand, silencing him. "No, David, I'm done tiptoeing around this. Your father needs to face reality. He's been freeloading off us for years, and now he's making ridiculous claims about deeds and ownership. It's pathetic." The word stabbed deep again, freeloader. But this time, instead of silence, I placed a folder on the table. "Pathetic?" I said evenly. "No, Melissa, what's pathetic is you pretending to own something you didn't pay for." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I slid the papers toward David. "Go ahead, son. Read them." With hesitant hands, David opened the folder. His eyes scanned the old deed, the mortgage statements, the notarized documents. His brow furrowed deeper with every page. "Dad, your name is right here," he whispered. Melissa's face blanched. "That doesn't mean anything. Those are old papers, not old." I interrupted sharply. "Active. This house was bought with my money. $40,000 from my savings covered your down payment. My name was never removed from the deed. And just last week, I secured in a trust. Which means, Melissa, you have no authority to sell, refinance, or force me out. Not now, not ever." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The children stared wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of the moment. David looked at me, then at his wife. His voice was low but firm. "Melissa, is this true? Did you really call my father a freeloader when he's the reason we even have this house?" She flushed crimson, stammering. "I was just frustrated. He's always here, taking. I cut in, my voice rising for the first time. "I gave you this house. I gave you money when David lost his job. I've sacrificed more than you'll ever know. And still you call me a burden? A freeloader?" The room went still. Melissa's face crumbled, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," David said, his voice suddenly sharp. He set the papers down with a thud. "You meant every word. And you were wrong." Melissa looked at him, stunned. David rarely raised his voice, but now he was staring at her with something she hadn't expected. Anger. "Dad's right," he continued. "Without him, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have this home. And I won't let you disrespect him again." Melissa's lips trembled. She pushed back on the table, her chair scraping the floor. "Fine. If that's how it is," she stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The kid sat frozen. David buried his face in his hands. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Better late than never, son." For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from me. Melissa's power had cracked wide open, and the silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was victory. The house was quieter after Melissa stormed out, though the quiet was thick with tension. David rubbed his temples, his face drawn, the children whispering softly to each other as if afraid to speak too loudly. For once, I didn't feel the weight of shame pressing on me. Instead, I felt lighter, as though I had finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for years. "Dad," David said after a long silence, his voice hoarse, "why didn't you tell me about the deed before? About everything you gave us?" I leaned back in my chair, cane resting against my leg. "Because, son, I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I loved you, because I wanted you and the kids to have a good life. That's what fathers do. But love doesn't mean being blind. And respect can't be demanded. It has to be earned. David's eyes shimmered, shame clouding his features. I should have stopped her. I let her say things, awful things, to you. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to fight. But that was wrong. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You found your voice tonight. That matters. Don't lose it again. The children slipped away to their rooms, leaving David and me in the dim dining room. Eventually, he sighed. I'll talk to her, but I don't know if she'll ever admit she was wrong. I shook my head. That's her battle, not yours. What matters now is that you know the truth. When I left that night, the air outside felt cool and clean, as though the world itself had shifted. For weeks, I had sat at that table swallowing humiliation, biting backwards, letting Melissa believe she had the upper hand. But now, the cards were on the table, and she had nothing left to play. The days that followed told me just how shaken she was. Melissa didn't call. She didn't come by. And when David dropped in to check on me midweek, he looked weary. She's furious, he admitted. Keeps saying you embarrassed her, that you undermined her in front of the kids. But deep down, I think she knows you were right. She just doesn't want to face it. I smiled faintly. Pride has a way of making people blind. But eventually, even pride runs out of excuses. At night, I found myself sleeping more soundly. The bitterness of her insults no longer echoed in my ears. Instead, I heard Mary's voice, soft and steady, as if she were whispering, "You stood tall, Walter. You didn't let them erase you." One evening, I sat at my desk, paper spread before me. Richard had helped me finalize everything. The trust that secured the house, the provisions that ensured David and the children would be cared for after I was gone, and protections that locked Melissa out from ever claiming ownership. I ran my hand over the folder and felt a deep satisfaction. My legacy was no longer in danger. When Sunday came again, I went to dinner as usual. Melissa was there, her face tight, her words clipped. She avoided my eyes all evening, but she didn't speak a word against me. Not one. And that silence, the same silence she once thought was my weakness, was now her defeat. As I left that night, David walked me to the door. He hesitated, then said, "Dad, I don't know how long it'll take, but maybe one day she'll understand. Maybe she'll finally see the truth." I patted his shoulder. Maybe she will. But whether she does or not, I know who I am, and I won't let anyone take that from me again. The porch light cast a warm glow as I stepped into night, cane tapping against the steps. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own family. I felt like the man who had built it, and that made all the difference. The weeks after the confrontation passed more quietly than I could have imagined. Melissa no longer tossed her barbed remarks at the dinner table. She spoke politely, if curtly, her voice stripped of the false sweetness she once used to disguise her disdain. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot, but it was silence, and in silence there is power. For me, those weeks were filled with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Each morning, I rose with the sun, brewed my coffee, and sat by the window overlooking Mary's roses. The air felt lighter. The weight Melissa had tried to put on my shoulders was gone. But I wasn't done. Richard and I met again, finalizing the trust. My share of the house would pass directly to David and the children, bypassing Melissa entirely. I also moved my savings into separate accounts, with clear instructions that Melissa would have no access. Everything I had built, every penny and brick in memory, would go to the people who mattered, my son and grandchildren. Melissa had underestimated me. She thought she could grind me down with whispers, paint me as a freeloader, and one day shove me quietly into a retirement home while she claimed the spoils. But she had forgotten who I was. I was Walter Harris. I had worked my fingers raw to build this family's foundation, and I wasn't about to let her tear it down. One Sunday, a month after it all began, the family gathered again. The table was full, the food plentiful. Melissa sat across from me, stiff and silent. But the children were lively, and David seemed lighter, as though he'd finally found his voice again. Halfway through dinner, one of the kids piped up, Grandpa, is it true you bought this house? Melissa froze. Her fork clinked against the plate. I smiled gently. That's right. Your grandma and I helped your parents get it. We wanted to make sure you all had a place to grow up safe and strong. Their eyes widened, little smiles spreading across their faces. David's gaze softened, pride flickering there. Melissa stayed silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't need to gloat. The truth was enough. After dinner, as I got up to leave, Melissa followed me to the door. For a long moment, she just stood there, her arms crossed, her face tight with pride. Finally, she muttered, I didn't realize you still had so much control. I met her eyes steadily. It's not about control, Melissa. It's about respect. Something you forgot. But let me remind you, I'm not a freeloader. I'm the reason you have what you do. Never forget that. Her face flushed, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. The papers, the truth, and the silence of her own husband stood against her. When I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt Mary's presence in the rustle of the roses by the porch. You did it, Walter. I could almost hear her whisper. You stood your ground. In the months that followed, Melissa kept her distance. She still cooked Sunday dinners, but the barb stopped. The respect might not have been genuine, but the insults were gone, and that was enough. David and I grew closer again. The children often visited me in the afternoons, helping the garden, listening to stories of their grandmother. And every time I looked at them, I knew I'd done the right thing. Melissa could stew in her silence, but she could never erase me. My legacy was secure. When my time comes and I finally join Mary, I'll leave behind more than savings and deeds. I'll leave behind dignity, lessons of respect, and proof that silence, when wielded carefully, can roar louder than any insult. And Melissa? She'll live with the memory of the night she tried to call me a freeloader, only to discover that I had been the foundation beneath her feet all along.